Hey, and welcome to Question Christianity. I'm Caleb Johnston. Over here to this direction is the one and only
Charles Graves.
There you go. And right down here,
Kevin Smith.
Thanks for being here with me tonight, guys. And of course, welcome to all the viewers who may tune into this, whether live or whether later on. So tonight, we are going to kind of finish up our series in talking about various issues that are brought up in regards to Christianity. So the last 4 weeks we've spent talking about the Bible and is it reliable? Can we trust it? That sort of thing. So tonight we're going to look at a very specific issue that is becoming more popular in recent years, particularly among, the internet and the memes you see, as well as, your YouTube atheist kind of follow this a lot. So we're going to be looking at Jesus mythicism. So anyone who's not familiar with this, Jesus mythicism is the belief that Jesus of Nazareth did not actually exist. So the claims of the Bible that Jesus lived, taught, died, resurrected, they can all be written off because he didn't exist at all. So this is, I would say probably in the last 10 years is when I've really seen it kind of grow. But it's fairly new as a theory anyway. Any thoughts before we kind of dive in here?
Well, I don't know where you're going to go, but I was wondering if you had a theory as to why it has come into popularity in the last 10 years, you think?
If I had to guess, I would say it's one of the easiest ways to deal with the claims of the Bible. C.S. Lewis has famous argument about liar, lord, or lunatic that deals with how you have to look at Jesus. So you either have to say that he was a liar because he made some pretty outrageous claims, claimed himself to be God. So he was either lying about that. He was either, as we would look at it today, a lunatic for saying something along those lines. Or you have to accept that he actually was who he said he was. One of the ways around this is you throw in the legend. So you say, well, Jesus didn't exist at all. Or if he was a real man, everything was blown completely out of proportion, and he was either a legend or didn't even exist at all as a historical figure.
Okay. Well, I would hope that our listeners / viewers would then keep their eye on the ball, because it has been, I think, pretty well accepted that Jesus is at least a historical figure for quite some time. And so if there's a new theory that he didn't exist, there should be new evidence to support that. So that would at least something to look for.
And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So I'm going to start us off, as I do for most of these, with us taking a look at what the actual claim is. So a lot of the videos online that kind of go into this theory are multiple hours long. So, to get a real grasp on some of this, you could go watch one of the people who presents this, such as Richard Carey or David FitzGerald. But we're going to kind of try to fairly address a lot of the claims they make here tonight, because we want to take a fair look at this. And we're going to look at the first part of a video that goes into this issue and covers some of the theory. So we're going to watch about 5 minutes of this video. We're not going to watch the whole thing. It's one of the shorter clips I could find that, wouldn't take up the whole show, just us watching a video. So we'll dive into this and take a look and go from there.
Did Jesus exist? Most people would say, of course he did. So much has been written about him after all, and so many people around the world believe he existed. And as you might expect, most biblical scholars at least agree that someone named Jesus probably existed in ancient Rome and that he was killed by the government. However, despite being such a purportedly significant historical figure, the evidence for his existence is remarkably weak. Other major characters of the ancient world, like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, were written about extensively during their lives, both by their allies and by their enemies. They also appeared in many official documents and even on coins, and their actions had immediate and dramatic consequences for their societies. Not so with Jesus. Despite his supposedly being involved with major events that would have rocked the ancient world, there is no direct, independent evidence that Jesus even existed. The only original accounts of his life can be found in the four Gospels and Pauline epistles. However, the Gospels were written by completely anonymous sources several decades after Jesus supposedly lived, and the epistles make no mention of any earthly human Jesus. Later Gospel writers also copied material directly from earlier Gospels. The oldest surviving copies of their works are translations of translations written hundreds of years later, and the wording in every copy contains alterations. Finally, none of the books claim to be eyewitness accounts to begin with. All of these issues are serious red flags for scholars seeking to validate historical claims. But even if those problems didn't exist, the Gospels and epistles were written by Christians eager to promote Christianity, and thus cannot be considered independent, unbiased sources. The only independent evidence within 100 years of when Jesus was supposed to have lived is a couple of short passages from historians Tacitus and Josephus. But they were both born years after Jesus supposedly died, and they gave no sources for their information. Furthermore, Tacitus only wrote a brief offhand comment and made no claims as to the historicity of Jesus. And although most scholars consider Josephus's work to be the better evidence, they also acknowledge that his writing was altered by Christian scribes to fit the Christian narrative. As such, neither historian's writings provide credible evidence for the existence of Jesus. And then there are the historical inconsistencies within the Bible itself. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was born in the year of a universal tax census, which started in 6 CE while Quirinius was governor of Syria. But Matthew claims Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, which ended in 4 BCE. Since Quirinius' reign started 10 years after Herod's death, Jesus could not have been born during the reigns of both Herod and Quirinius. Not only that, but apparently Roman records reveal that the first universal census didn't actually occur until the reign of Emperor Vespasian in 74 CE, which was decades after Quirinius' reign. So the story of Jesus involves some serious historical contradictions right from the very beginning. But it gets worse. The Gospel of Matthew claims that King Herod had every infant boy in the region put to death, yet not a single historian of that period even mentioned such a mass murder, even though there would have been widespread outrage. And this includes the historian Josephus, who hated King Herod and made a point of recording all of his offenses. Matthew also says that Jesus gave numerous sermons to many thousands of people throughout Judea, astounding everyone with his teachings and amazing miracles of healing and raising the dead. His fame spread far and wide, and he even performed miracles for various important leaders in the region. And yet there is no record of any of this until the Gospels were written many decades later. Also, Jesus supposedly rode into Jerusalem and was greeted with a parade and citywide celebration for him as the miracle-working King of the Jews. Romans normally just executed rebels without due process, yet for some reason Jesus received a high-profile trial involving important leaders and celebrities, including the Jewish high priest, Pontius Pilate, and even King Herod himself. Jesus also had thousands of his own supporters, including such high-ranking leaders as a royal official, a centurion, a temple leader, and members of the Jewish ruling council. Yet nobody recorded any of this.
All right, I think I've seen about enough of this. It
I
does
get-
continue for a
I get
while longer.
PTSD when you do things like that.
What was that?
I get PTSD when you do things like that. It's because here's why. Just there's so much going by, and it's like as soon as I want to respond to the first point, then it's moving on, and so I it's like I'm getting trampled. We certainly have we have answers for all this. It's just frustrating that it moves so quick. Anyway, so
yeah, no, I agree, and that's where the rest of this video goes as well. It continues to kind of try to pile on what it does from the rest of the way here on out. Like, I would say the strongest information in this video, it's already given. So that'll give you an idea as to the content. Certainly viewers are welcome to go check it out after the episode and see, but I think in general, that should give at least an idea of kind of the claims we're kind of dealing with here tonight. A lot of those, I hope that if you've been present for the last few episodes and watched as we discussed the New Testament in particular, we've actually already covered a lot of these claims and dealt with the reliability of the New Testament. So we've already addressed, when the Gospels were written. We've addressed the recency of the Gospels compared to other historical documents. Some of the very claims made in this video, we've taken head on in the last couple of episodes and addressed that, the Gospels are one of the earliest, related to the events they're describing, they are one of the earliest written documentations, as well as the fact that, the errors contained within are relatively minor. I mean, we're talking a less than 1% actually affects anything of substance. So, while you can say there's a lot of errors, which, yes, you can agree between different manuscripts, you're going to have differences in spellings and grammar, mistakes in punctuation, all that sort of stuff. And there's lots of it, but it helps us to be able to compare manuscripts and see what the original probably was when these were things that were copied from them. So, we're not going to cover everything tonight. We're going to address very specifically this claim that Jesus didn't exist. And we've covered the New Testament pretty extensively, at least at a kind of introductory level in our last few videos. So,
They say something just preliminary. The way the video clip started out is a bit of a bait and switch on the standard of expectations. A little bit of equivocation of what it means to be a significant historical figure. The comparison with, say, Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great and Jesus, they're all significant historical figures, but in very different roles. If Jesus had been claimed to be the emperor of the Roman Empire, we might expect volumes dedicated to describing him. But I guess by the skeptic standard, we'd have to discount those since they would have been written by people on his side, right? Anyhow, the main point is that Jesus, it's not claimed that Jesus was an Alexander the Great, a political, military, conquering, empire-wide figure. If so, then what we ought to expect in so-called independent historical references, that would be a much higher bar than it is. So right off the bat, I think the video narrator has set up a subtle expectations game. You have to clear that up first.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's very difficult for us here and now to just think, well, gosh, you'd think if this guy was doing thing, I just grab a piece of paper and a pencil and I'd start writing something down. But piece of paper and pencil are uncommon. It's different to be able to read than it is to write. Those are two different skills in the ancient Near East. And certainly the Rome biographers were not going around taking notes on every rebel in the entire Roman domain or for anyone that was doing teaching or anything. And most of his ministry, well, I think that's a good point. I want to talk about something else that the narrator said right at the beginning, which I think is actually, believe it or not, it's a huge score on our side. He said this. He says, "Of course, biblical scholars all think he existed."
Yeah, I caught that too. Yeah.
Okay, so now I think our audience needs to understand. Now, it's easy to think, well, of course, biblical scholars are all Christians. No, not at all. I'd say probably a vast majority, maybe you could comment on this, but at least a large majority of biblical scholars are non-believing atheists. So for him to say that, what he's basically saying is all the people who this is their profession, who look into this on both sides of the aisle, all agree that Jesus exists. And then he just throws it away. He's like, the academic, the overwhelming academic opinion is that he exists, but never mind that. Of course, they all think he existed. Let's take a look at some other stuff.
Most relevant academic discipline, those professionals admit that he existed. But
yeah,
that's like saying, well, most astronomers think the Earth revolves around the sun, but really,
haven't you ever just looked at the horizon? It looks really flat. But yeah, so I think that's an easy one to skip over, and I think that is a typical thing. So that's not a one-off. That seems to be the type of arguments that are going on here. They sound clever. They sound convincing. They are super shallow. So, and especially that one where basically the narrator is saying, he doesn't say it like this, but he's saying the professionals in the field, who this is their field, the pros, as you said, the pros all think he existed.
All right. When I did a post-grad course at UVA on the historical Jesus, the professor, Harry Gamble, the very first day in the course, he said, "Let's be upfront. We're going to approach this with the methodology of naturalism, naturalistic methodology, which is a philosophical way of saying up front we assume there's nothing supernatural. So right off the bat, there's that. So we went forward with the course. I did call him out on that, but anyway, we went forward with the course. And despite his methodological naturalism, his thoroughgoing critique, there is never a question of whether Jesus was a historical figure. It's just, what do we do with this figure? How do we explain away what seems to be miraculous? That sort of thing. It's not even a thought that we're not dealing with real events.
Correct.
At some level.
I would say, I think
UVA experience, grad religion, that would be typical for any major university or academic professional in the field of biblical or just religious historical studies in general.
The last time I looked at Wikipedia, which wasn't that long ago, not that Wikipedia is the end-all source, but on Wikipedia, the last time I checked, it said something like the two undisputed facts about Jesus were that he was historical and that he was crucified. That's not nothing. It certainly seems to go against what this guy is saying, that he probably didn't exist.
That's true, and I think we've already largely discussed this, so I'm not going to go through all this. We've kind of already covered a lot of reasons why people may have this objection. I think one of the strangest ones to hear is, of course, that they believe the evidence is weak for the historical Jesus. That's fairly rare compared to some of the other reasons we've discussed here tonight. Also, let's see here. So there's some key ideas that Jesus mythicists usually put forth in terms of of their claims, and we heard most of these in the videos, that the epistles don't mention a historical Jesus, that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, that there are limited secular sources, there's no miracles in secular sources, and that Jesus and even possibly the disciples did not exist as actual figures. And we've got a comment here. Doesn't Buddhism believe Jesus existed? I'm not sure on that one. A lot of the Buddhist teachings I'm familiar with would predate Jesus.
Yeah. Certainly they would be willing to adopt him in as a deity. Wait, we're Buddhism. I'm thinking Hinduism. Disregard.
That too, but definitely Islam is historically confirmed. Islam admits that Jesus not only existed, but was a virgin conceived sinless prophet from God.
Not bad.
So we've, again, another thing we've kind of already talked about in conversation, but there are some surface issues here with these kind of claims. So these are kind of some of those first things I would throw out there and put a pin in if I saw these in a video, and I'd pay attention to looking out for these kind of things. Is, arguments from ignorance, i.e., we don't have any secular sources that say Jesus performed miracles, so clearly he didn't. Over or understating evidence, which we've already talked about that going on in this video and how things are being overstated. Rejecting sources based purely on a bias. And we're going to look at kind of what bias are we talking about here. We've talked about that a little bit as well. Is the concern of people putting forth these claims, is it truth? Or are they looking for a way to disprove Christianity? Are they honestly seeking the truth on these issues? Or are they just trying to find a way to say Christianity isn't going to work for me? And then, of course, the willingness to consider evidence and, are they offering a better explanation for the origins of Christianity? So you'll see with most of the writers like Richard Carrier and David FitzGerald, and there's a few other scholars that, will put forth this theory, but are they actually offering alternative explanations that work to explain the evidence? So we're going to dive through, and we'll go through this pretty quick. So you guys feel free to dive in and stop me if you have points or anything you want to add to any of this. But we're going to look at some of the sources that we have for Jesus. So we've got non-Christian sources as well as Christian sources. And we're going to look at these, and we're going to talk a little bit about bias and all that good stuff as we go through. And we're not going to touch on every source. We are touching on some highlights, but by no means are we going to touch on everything that's here. So for anybody questioning the New Testament in general, go back and watch our last few videos. We addressed this extensively. But just some key points as to, can we trust the New Testament writers? Some important details we need to consider are that, they include extremely embarrassing details about the writers, something you would not necessarily expect if they were pure works of fiction. They include the same about Jesus as well, along with difficult sayings. It would certainly be easier to write some of those things off rather than keep them in many cases. They include more than 30 historically confirmed people. They challenged readers to check out the verifiable facts. So they encouraged the readers at the time when they could still go research this to do so. They describe miracles with simple, unembellished accounts. In much later documents, you'll see that miracles are expanded in ways that make make them less credible, if you will. So someone who writes off miracles altogether may not agree with that. But if you read, 3rd, 4th, 5th century miracle accounts compared to the ones we see in the Gospels, you'll see that they are exaggerated in such a way that it certainly takes away from the credibility a little bit. And then, of course, the biggest one for me, I think, is they abandoned their long-held beliefs in Judaism, along with many of the practices, and adopted new ones, and then didn't deny this under the threat of death. Susan makes a good point here, too. They don't appear pompous. So, and I think that's a good point. The including embarrassing details kind of points to that.
Can we go back a slide? Back one.
Sure.
Just a general point. I from both sides, from Christian and non-Christian, I've heard some people seem to want to focus more on the non-Christian sources with some type of reasoning like, well, of course you can't really trust the Christian sources because they believed it, and so maybe they're not as credible. And that's just that's a non sequitur. So that's not even logical. You don't need to. I think we talked about this before during the other series, but to believe something is not to be discredited as a witness. So if a woman was raped, she's not prevented from taking the stand because she believes that so-and-so raped her. Someone who was in the camps of Auschwitz isn't discredited because to the Holocaust deniers because, well, of course they believe the Holocaust is there. That they're a believer, and so believing something does not mean you're discredited. Neither does disbelieving. What is creditable is, does the testimony have signs, which is the things that you went over, that show it to be creditable? Are they credible witnesses? Which can be on both sides, by the way. But this idea that the Christian sources are somehow to be demoted below non-Christian sources is, again, it goes against the scholarly view. The scholarly academic view is that the Christian Gospels are the best sources for the life and the life of Christ.
Right. It's, I think about, things like crimes or murders that happen, and to write off, witnesses who may have been there. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider and ask ourselves whether bias is involved. That's certainly a valid question. But, because the brother of the accused murderer was there and saw the whole thing, it doesn't mean he's an unreliable witness. Mm-hmm. It means there's a possibility that bias exists.
Correct.
But it doesn't mean we throw it out. We can ask that question, but we have to look at it. We don't toss it out a priori.
They're two completely separate things. They're two completely separate things. And that is the standard in a court of law. It's like, it doesn't matter what you believe. It matters if you're a credible witness. Anyway, so I think that's a very important point. And again, the academic view is that the Gospels are the best. And these are people who don't believe in the deity of Christ, who have problems with some or maybe even many of the individual parts of the Gospels, still believe that the Christian sources are the best sources. They are the best. The other ones are important too. They're great. Hey, I'll take it all. But the motion of the Christian sources automatically below the non-Christian sources is bad history.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons is we looked at this some when we went through the New Testament, but to look at the actual sources themselves and to compare. And we talked a little bit about undesigned coincidences. So some things that occur in one gospel that aren't really explained, that then we find the answer to in another one. So we're going to just briefly touch on a couple of these. So for example, in John 18:32, Pilate asked Jesus whether he is a king. What prompted this question? We don't have anything there to indicate in John what could have prompted this question. However, In Luke,
Hmm.
the Jews did make that very charge against Jesus. So we have something that's not answered in John that is explained by a passage in Luke. And we touched on a few of these last time, but you can find them throughout. And even there are some that even link to non-Christian sources as well.
Hmm.
So in Mark 14 and 15, the charge is reiterated that Jesus threatened to destroy the temple. Yet nowhere in the synoptics do we find his saying anything about this. Not even something that could be plausibly misunderstood. So what's behind this charge? Well, in John, we find Jesus saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rise it up. So again, the question that arises in Mark is answered in John. Next, we're going to kind of take a look at some of the epistle teachings. The claim is that they don't mention a historical Jesus in any way. They see a glorified figure whose spirit or whatever, but not historical. Well, tell me what you think with some of these. So, as you can see from some of the language here, it certainly doesn't sound like describing a pure spiritual being. Since Christ suffered in flesh, you also be armed with the same thought. God bore witness to him and his followers through signs, wonders, and various miracles and gifts of the Spirit. Hard to have signs, wonders, miracles, and followers if you're merely a spiritual being. For saying that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show the truthfulness of God in order to conform the promises given to the patriarchs. And then I command you before God, who makes all things alive, and Christ Jesus, the one who, bearing his testimony before Pontius Pilate, made the good confession. And the reason we're looking at the epistles here is that many of the epistles are written even earlier than the Gospels. So we're looking at things that are even closer to the time of the events than the Gospels, which kind of lay out things in an ancient biography style. So now we're going to look at a couple of the secular sources. So Tacitus, writing around plus 82 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, gives this passage, and he was a Roman historian. Nero falsely accused those the populace called Christians. The author of this name, Christ, was put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was emperor, but the dangerous superstition, though suppressed for the moment, broke out again, not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but even in the city of Rome.
Yeah, the end of that quote is, I think, hilarious. It says, I have where the plague, this is at the end, where the plague first arose, but in Rome itself, where all the horrible and shameful things of this world collect and find a home. I just think that's hilarious. I mean, he's no fan of Christianity. He's like, yeah, I came here like with all the other plagues, but it's certainly no fan. So,
yeah, not to mention, it combines some of the things we saw in the epistles about being crucified before Pontius Pilate. That's something that, like you mentioned, the crucifixion is well attested in both Christian and non-Christian sources.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at this quote right here, just look at this quote and look at all the history that's compacted into this one thing. You have Nero. Is that accurate? Yep. Time and place. Yeah, that's right. You have author of this name, Christ. So is that accurate? Yes, that's what the disciples were calling him. You got a historical figure, Pontius Pilate. You have Tiberius, who was emperor. You have a place called Rome. You have a place called Judea. Like, there's a lot there. And it's all just in that one little thing. There's a lot of history built in right there that all coalesces.
Yeah.
Right. I really, the historical value of that, there's a lot in that short passage. I mean, as I read it, there's probably 6 claims, at least 4 of which have directly to do with Jesus himself. First, that he's the founder of this movement, after whom the Christians are called. Second, that he's put to death. Third, by whom and when.
Pilate, right?
Right, and under Tiberius.
Correct.
So Jesus is a real figure who had followers after his name, who was executed, and at a certain time, and much to the chagrin of Tacitus, this execution only shut up his followers briefly.
Right.
And for some reason, very shortly after his execution, something superstition, something happened that made them just really take off, really explode.
Yeah, I was just as you were going through
resurrection.
Go ahead.
Yeah, probably his resurrection, or at least their belief in it.
Oh, that certainly seems to be the implicit claim there. As you read through it, I didn't notice it before, but even the phrase dangerous superstition implies that he was teaching something that was different and new. He wasn't just a Jew teaching Jewish stuff.
Yeah,
he was teaching this new, dangerous, superstitious stuff.
Right. There's a specific content, supernatural content or claim of content to this message very early.
There's a lot there. God's providence, man.
A lot there, yeah.
All right, so.
And the teaching started in Judea, by the way, and had to make its way to Rome.
Right.
So from origin 4.
Gosh, and how well does that align with take this to Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the world?
And we're talking about something too, the video we watched wrote it off because Tacitus was born after the time of Jesus. I mean, that's very much like saying, I couldn't write something about, a distant family member who had passed away a couple generations ago. So I think especially for someone who's a historian and experienced in researching and finding out this stuff in a very verbal culture, it's not an unreasonable time frame to be looking at here.
And if anyone had access to anything that was written, so we don't have any, I mean, we're covering the stuff we had. That doesn't mean more wasn't written. Now, I'm not saying it was. I'm just saying if it was, the guy that would have access to that would be the Roman historiographer, Tacitus.
Because so little stuff survives from that time frame. Given, paper even today, very little of it's going to survive another 200-300 years down the road, not to mention 2,000 years. So the amount of stuff available then, I have no doubt, far exceeded what we have available in general today in ancient manuscripts.
Yeah. So Tacitus was in a excellent position to have whatever documents or writings or whatever would have existed at that time.
And equally important, he was in an excellent position to want to write this off in any way he could, such as, that's just a myth that never happened. Why didn't he take that tack as an anti-Christian Roman?
That's an excellent point.
Because he had to deal with the material at hand.
Tacitus clearly thought Jesus was a historical figure. There's no ambiguity in that at all. Everything is exactly opposite. It's history, person, place, thing.
Really thinks it's unfortunate that there was such a person who had followers and this plague spread. Why not eradicate it easily by pointing out that it didn't even have an origin, if it didn't.
Yeah, the only thing that's interesting, the only thing that was superstition was the nature of the historical person's teaching.
Yeah, not the existence of the person.
Right. Okay.
One of the next ones we have is Josephus, who was writing actually a little before Tacitus, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because it's a very, very deep issue, especially in regards to the second passage. The first one is, written by or agreed upon by most historians that it's accurate. It hasn't been altered or changed in any way. And that's a passage that just states the brother of Jesus. It's talking about James' martyrdom, and it says the brother of Jesus who is called the Messiah. So this is a mention of Jesus here in regards to James. It mentions his brother as well. Kind of hard to have a brother if you don't exist. And then a second longer passage, which we'll kind of dangle it out there as something listeners could go research a little bit more. But it goes into much more depth about the crucifixion as well. And the only part of this that's really significantly questioned is, if I recall correctly, where it discusses Jesus appearing to his disciples after the resurrection. So it's essentially accrediting this resurrection to Jesus and that he was the Messiah. In many ways, it's a confirmation of that. And the thought is that later Christian scribes may have written in part of this passage in trying to alter it or expand upon the narrative that Josephus provided, because Josephus was a Jew, so it's unlikely, unless he had converted at some point around this time, that he would actually write about Jesus being the Messiah. But again, only part of this passage is questioned. It's no question that Jesus is mentioned, as well as his brother James, by Josephus as well, and probably in at least significant detail. And this is 60 years later.
Yeah, it probably was altered, and it definitely indicates that Jesus was a part of history. Not the part. I said that the wrong way. Some of it probably was altered, but the part that wasn't makes clear that Josephus thought that Jesus was a real person. I mean, definitely.
Now, next we've got Ignatius, who was a Christian, but this is 80 years later, so this is not part of the Gospels. But in one of his letters, he puts it this way: "And so be deaf when someone speaks to you apart from Jesus Christ, who was from the race of David and from Mary, who was truly born, both ate and drank, was truly persecuted at the time of Pontius Pilate, was truly crucified and died, while those in heaven and on earth and under earth looked on." Kind of hard to say he was writing about a non-physical person. So again, people would throw this out as a biased source because he was a Christian, but this is an explanation of how he understood Christian beliefs at the time and what he knew. So again, 80 years later, you've made up someone within 80 years who never existed. Fairly unlikely. And we're talking about even less than that. Once we get into the epistles, we're talking about writing within, less than a decade.
Was Ignatius the disciple of John? Do I have that right?
That's Polycarp, who also has early writings in that era, along with Clement of Rome. Similar.
All right, before we move on to this, Susan mentioned, and this was a few moments ago, so it was probably back to the Josephus passage, weren't the people crying out for his arrest because he claimed to be king of the Jews?
Yes.
I certainly think that's obviously one of the reasons we're given. As well as, from the Gospels, we can also see that it's blasphemy as well. He was claiming to be God. Again, we covered some of that a couple weeks ago, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now, but that's certainly one factor. So we've got some nails in the mythicist coffin. We've got no early or late historical sources that make any indication or accusation that Jesus didn't actually exist. And they made lots of accusations about Christians. There were plenty of claims that Christians were incestuous or cannibals, for the reason that they partook in the flesh and blood of Jesus in communion, symbolic partaking. But the Romans claimed that this was real and that they were cannibals. There were claims of incest because Christians called one another brother and sister. So there were lots of accusations among many secular sources, Jewish sources, but none of these accusations at all point to Jesus didn't really exist. That would be a pretty obvious accusation to make if it was at all a possibility.
Would you mind if we just flipped that and took the negatives out and said something like, all of the evidence indicates that Jesus actually existed?
No, assume even the oppositional record grants his reality.
Yeah, I just it's nice to hear it kind of both ways. There isn't any that doesn't. No early and late historical sources make any indication that he didn't exist. All evidence we have indicates he did exist. All the evidence. I mean, that happens to be on point with the topic, but
yeah, we're going to end with a really good quote that puts it that way.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. So we've got a multitude of sources. We've barely scratched the surface with the sources that discuss Jesus as if he were a real person. We've touched on a couple of the highlights, but it's by no means the only sources. Jesus mythicism also has almost no credible supporters. I was listening to Dr. Mike Licona this week, and he reports that according to Richard Carrier, who is the lead Jesus mythicist among scholars, that there are possibly 6 scholars in relevant fields in the world who support Jesus mythicism.
Can we just flip that? I mean, again, let's just flip it and say, what would the world think if we were claiming that Jesus actually existed and the number of scholars that we had on our side of the thousands and thousands in their academic field on this subject said that he didn't? People would just be writing us off as absolute nuts. I mean, they do that anyway, but they'd have good reason. And so it's not nothing to be ignored. It's like 6. I mean,
yeah. And I think from this, it kind of builds to the last point, which is that Jesus mythicism relies on assumptions of bias to write off all the Christian sources. And then it's on par with a massive conspiracy theories among credible scholarship. So you've got to write off all these scholars who disagree with this as being clearly wrong about history, as being completely mistaken, or themselves being biased, even many of them who are atheist, agnostic, or skeptical, that that it's that obvious that Jesus didn't exist. So, you're talking about a conspiracy theory among modern scholars. And I mean, David FitzGerald's work very much goes this way, that there's a huge conspiracy within academia to exclude anyone who's a mythicist from even being able to go into relevant fields. So this is one of the quotes I wanted to finish with, and this is by Bart Ehrman. He's a professor at it's going to slip my mind here.
The North Carolina, maybe?
Yeah, that's it. UNC. And he makes this quote, and he is a atheist / agnostic. He kind of teeters back and forth over the years. But I think it's worth reading this quote. And he's a New Testament scholar. Every single source that mentions Jesus up until the 18th century assumed that he actually existed. That is true no matter what period you choose to examine: the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, late antiquity, and before. It is true of every source from our earliest periods: the 4th century, the 3rd century, the 2nd century, and the 1st century. It is true of every author of every kind, Christian, Jewish, or pagan. Most striking, it is true not just for those who came to believe in Jesus, but also non-believers in general and the opponents of Christianity in particular. Many scholars have found this significant. Not even the Jewish and pagan antagonists who attacked Christianity and Jesus himself entertained thought that he never existed. This is quite clear from reading the writings of Christian apologists, starting with such authors as the anonymous writer of the letter to Diognetus, and the more famous writers Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, all from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, all of whom defend Jesus against a number of charges, many of them scandalous, but they do not drop one hint that anyone has claimed he did not exist.
Yeah, he probably existed.
I would think after all this, probably so. So how do we respond when facing this kind of objection? As Christians, how should we respond when getting the claim that Jesus didn't exist? As always, first off, we want to, be respectful, gentle, and we want to go about things in a way that isn't an attack. We want to have a conversation with people so the conversation can continue, and so that they may actually be willing to listen to what evidence there is versus just reinforcing whatever belief or possible bias they may bring to the table. So some good questions may be, how did you conclude that Jesus didn't exist? Who have they been listening to? How did they come up with this? What research have they done into the historicity of Jesus? What evidence do you have that supports your position? Have you looked to scholars on this issue? What kinds of bias could influence these claims? So, talking about what may actually be behind a given belief. Have you read the New Testament with an open mind? So have you looked at it not just as a biased source, but have you read it to assess whether you think the claims there are actually legitimate in any way, or does this seem like credible writing? Writing it off is one thing, but setting back and looking at it with an open mind and reading through it is a really good place to start assessing whether you can actually believe this or not. What about the evidence makes you doubt its reliability? And what would change your mind about Jesus? So those are just a few conversation starters for questions in regards to this issue. We really ripped through this pretty fast here. So certainly if anybody watching has questions, even if it's after this live stream's over, if you have questions and want to throw them in the chat, one of us will certainly try to respond as we can to those sort of things. But, throwing in questions now is also fine, or thoughts. Anything from you guys that you would give in your, 2-minute answer to Jesus mythicism.
Well, I think I'm going to say what actually you say more than I do. So I'm going to give you full credit on this, which is asking, and you kind of allude to it here, but asking for a little bit more personal history for the person that you're talking with. What was your background? Did you grow up in a Christian background? If I could show you that Jesus was historical, what would that mean? Let me put it this way. The academic evidence is overwhelming for the existence of Jesus. Therefore, someone who is denying it is denying it for, I can't see but two main reasons. One, they're just ignorant, and I mean that in the technical terms. They just don't know. And so they might be very well interested in the academic history of Jesus. The other side is more likely an emotional problem or an emotional resistance. And you cannot overcome an emotional resistance with facts. It's just, well, I don't want to say you can't. It's for human beings, me included, it's when I have an emotional barrier or something, facts don't matter because facts aren't the issue. It's an emotional problem. And so if we're going to be a good witness and a good friend and a viable witness for our Savior, then we got to deal with people where they are. And so just, and you say this more than I do, Caleb, so, 100% credit to you for that. But you got to deal with the person.
For somebody who is willing to go back behind this information, look at some of these sources even for themselves, the more they do, I think, the more it might dispel this this very postmodern spiritual idea, that Christ is just something ephemeral. It's something of a mythological character in general. When you start working with material, historical documents, it just sort of changes the mental landscape. Like, I'll just throw this out. Anybody who really wants to, for example, the quote that Caleb put up. This is an academic, a reference, library reference book type thing that you can look up. Can I share the screen for a second?
Sure.
Let me see if I can share mine.
While you're doing that,
Then
I'll just say here were some of the sources that I used in preparing this presentation and some good sources to start. But yeah, you can go ahead and try and share your screen, Kevin. I'll put it up here.
I've tried to put up the original source from Tufts University that they have digitized an English translation of Tacitus along with the Latin, the original Latin. Is that showing on the screen?
Let me see. It's not showing yet. Let me stop mine. Try one more time.
How about now?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay. Well, someone can look up Tacitus.
If you got the link, you can put it in the chat, maybe.
Oh yeah, I'll even this link will take you even right to the actual page with the English and Latin side by side. Yeah. So let's see.
Yeah, if you have the link, I can throw it up on the screen.
All right. It's just such a nice academic reference, really easy, but obviously, historical reference work. So I copy paste that and go right to the very page in Tacitus we're talking about in section 15 of the Annals.
Is it a translation of a translation of a translation?
No. As a Roman historian, he wrote in Latin, and the Latin is there on the page.
All right.
If someone wants to translate it themselves, better than Tufts, they can have a go at it. But this is, this is a standard non-Christian academic reference work, and the English is accessible that way. Over on the right side of that, Caleb, do you see where it says Latin and then it says load? Very far right.
I'm looking on the left, so that's the problem.
Go up just a little bit. There's a line that says Latin, and then at the end of that line, there's a link that says load that. And you see, that's the original text. Okay, there's English translation by Latin scholars, historians. It's just a standard reference work.
It's really cool.
It has nothing to do with Christians or religious thinkers.
Did you put the URL somewhere? Did you post it?
I can. I will.
Oh, I
I will
got
throw
this.
that. I can throw that in the chat, and I'll try and throw it in the video description on YouTube for this later.
Leave it to Kevin to come up with something like this, huh?
This
Awesome.
particular reference tool, you can look up Suetonius there also. As Caleb said, there's so many other, there's other things, but it's nice to have an English accessible translation of some of the major classic works.
Oh gosh, look at this. An immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they are torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Also historical.
An awful lot for someone to go through for somebody who didn't exist.
Yeah, all they had to do is recant at any time. They spared.
Well, gentlemen, our time is up. Thanks for sharing that resource, Kevin. I think that's fantastic. So I want to welcome people to come back in 2 weeks. We're going to change gears pretty significantly, and we're going to start looking at some social and cultural issues. So we're going to take as long as we need to kind of dive in and look at what people mean by definitions. We're going to look at what people mean by social justice. We're going to take a little bit of a look at critical theory. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with that, but we're going to look at a lot of the social issues going on right now, as well as the worldviews that can influence those issues. And we're going to try and be careful and take our time really looking at what people mean by definitions and what people are actually saying versus just trying to build a straw man of kind of what's going on. We want to really take time to be sensitive and look at this issue and give this issue the time it deserves, because it's a very big thing right now within the church, and it has potential to bring about significant change, not just within the culture, but within the church itself. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at that and the worldviews behind it.
Yeah, that'll be an important podcast, I think.
That it will. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. And thanks to all the viewers, either live or later. We enjoy the comments and the interaction. And hope everybody has a great night.
Yeah, see you in 2 weeks.